Hello, everyone. Okay, hopefully by this time you have now had a chance to get in and start playing around with database applications. Hopefully you've been able to connect to the database, play around with the database, load combo boxes based upon getting some parameters, actually displaying different types of information on your forms from the database. Hopefully you have some fun doing that and got it all working. If you're struggling with that, I highly recommend you reach out and make sure that you don't fall behind. This is a building process, which means we're building on what last week. Okay, so I'm assuming you did last week, and I'm assuming that you got it working. Okay, I'm not saying you've mastered it, but I'm hopefully that you got past those certain parts. And again, when it comes to databases, just don't make it too hard. I mean, there's a lot of things that are very much the same in connecting and opening and closing. That's all the same stuff. And the objects that we're going to be using with ADO.NET should be very similar all the way through. Okay? And so a lot of consistency throughout it. Yeah, you got to be smart. You got to figure out when to do stuff, how to do stuff, what to change, and so on. But for the most part, there's a consistency all the way through doing database applications. All right. This week, what we're going to focus on is the remaining pieces of this thing called CRUD. I never really have brought up CRUD before. CRUD stands for Create, Read, Update, and Delete. It's a programming term. It's used extensively in the industry. Okay, it basically talks about being able to insert, select, update, and delete data from a database through a database application. So if you get into your interviews and somebody says, "How are you with CRUD programming?" this is what they're talking about. Okay, and that's pretty much what you're going to be doing. By the time you get done with this semester, you should have a nice CRUD application that does many different things that I highly recommend you keep for your portfolios and show people during your interviews for co-oping or permanent placement. All right. So that's pretty much what it means. There's an article, and I gave it to you in this week's contents that I highly recommend you read. It's not very long, but I think it's really worth looking at and making sure you understand this kind of terminology. This week, what we're going to focus on is the create, update, and delete. We'll always be doing reading. You did that last week, and we're going to continue to do more and more select statements and more sophisticated select statements with aggregates and so on in the coming weeks. But with that said, this week we're going to focus on that create, update, and delete. Okay? So let's get started. I have an application sitting out here that's going to do a couple different things. Number one is going to have a main form, okay, and it's going to allow me to do so. Let's go ahead and start this up. And there you go. And so I'm going to have a main form. It's a multiple form application. You're going to create something very similar this week, okay? So you have a multiple form application where it's going to add a student, either or update a student, delete a student, or display students. So you're going to do something very similar with your applications, just like I said. So if I hit an add student, it's going to bring up a form to add students, okay? As you can see, the form is sitting here for me to put information in. It also has some drop downs. These drop downs are based upon some tables within our database. Our database now, I made a change to our database in our script, and I basically took it to second normal form. Okay, if you recall, second normal form is basically eliminating redundant data. The redundant data that was in my students and so on was, in this case, cities, states, and races. Okay, and so I took those out as second normal form. These second normal form tables are also what's called lookup tables. We're going to utilize these tables. I know when we were in IT 111, you may have looked at them and said, okay, we pulled them out. Bob said it was for accuracy, or my instructor said it was for accuracy. I'm not quite sure what they're talking about. Well, now what we're going to do is utilize these tables actually within our programs to ensure accuracy, meaning that they can only enter the things that we want them to enter. The limitation being these tables right here, like cities, states, and races. The only cities they can enter are the ones that are here. If they want to add a new city, we're going to have to go into the database and add it, or create an application for the administrator to add it. If they want to add a new state, it's the same type of piece all the way through. But if our races is exhaustive, and I don't believe it is at all, so please don't get mad at me if I don't have your race sitting here. But in this case here, if it was exhaustive, we don't need to add any more. They must pick from the limited set of races that are actually being used today in the world. Does that make sense? That's second normal form. So we want to now populate our the inputs that we want them to do based upon this. And guess what? We're going to have the primary key here, and now that primary key, when we insert the row, will now become the foreign key to those particular tables. Remember that from IT 111? That's how it works here. So we'll watch it and see how it goes. Okay, so so how are we doing all this? So what I want to do, how this would work, we sit back and let's see, let's put in, I don't know, I'll put in Joe Burrow. We'll see how timely this video, if Joe Burrow's still around 5 years from now, if somebody's looking at this, and or if we ever win a Super Bowl, who knows? Okay, and I don't know when, and I'm going to also show you this really cool little date picker you can add to your program. Pretty fun. I don't know when Joe Burrow was born. I have no idea. We'll say 1999. I don't think that's right. But and so on. And we add information, and the student has been added. Now Joe Burrow's a student of mine. That's great. And if we go over to the display students, which again you'll do this also. You kind of did this last week. We should see everybody who's in my database, and there's good old Joe right there. Okay. All right. Great. 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 We'll exit here and go from here. So how did we do this? How did we do this? I'm sure you're asking. Once again, I have my main form. It's nothing fancy here. It's just a form with buttons. And all I did was use the show dialog, everything you should already know about multiple form applications, correct? Okay. If you're a little bit unfamiliar with that, you can kind of look at this as your basis. Don't make it hard. There's nothing hard here to making a multiple form application. I still have my mod database utilities for my all my assignments for databases. You just should copy that over, and we'll go from there. I have a delete, I have an add, and I have an update. Again, these two I haven't really done anything with, but we're going to focus on the add students. Just like we talked about last week, we need to load these drop-down boxes, these combo boxes, prior to the loading of the form, okay? And so we're going to do that the exact same way. We're going to go to the form load, and in this case, I got 3 of them, one for city, one for state, one for race. And as you see, I did the exact same way. I went and got the city ID and the actual city string, okay? And I got my value member and my display member. And I did it for states, and I did it for race before I closed it. So very similar to what you did last week. It's identical to what you did last week. The only changes are the select statement from where you're getting it from, and making sure you change these pieces right here, these 3 things, and the data table is the one that you're actually focused on. Does that make sense? Pretty simple, correct? Pretty simple. See how we're building? Okay. Our next piece here we need to do then is to literally add the students. So there's some pieces to this, and again, you're going to try this, but utilize my code as your example. Once again, I told you there's a lot of cutting and pasting here, but there's also modifying. Obviously, you got to do it for your database. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to declare variables for all your inputs, okay? So all your inputs, you're going to declare variables and what they actually are. Most things are strings. Obviously, the city and the state are now going to be a number because we're actually going to put that, in the foreign key. So that would be an integer. And my date of birth will make that a date, okay? I'm going to go ahead and create my objects that we had before, okay? My command, my select, my insert, and my DB reader. So I do have, I'm not doing, I'm going to use one for a select statement. You'll see that here in a second. That's part of this, but I also have to create a command for my insert. So this is actually new too, okay? So please note this. My data source, which is my results set, okay? And I also going to have this int next primary key and rows affected. These are 2 new variables that you need to incorporate to do an insert. And you'll see how they're used here in a second. Okay, in my laziness, please forgive me, there's so much going on, but in my laziness, I did not validate the data. Of course we need to validate the data. I actually want you to probably go ahead and make this a modular program when you actually do yours. So please validate the data based upon how you've been taught. We don't want bad data going into the database. So with that said, validate it, make sure it's there if it's required, make sure it's numeric if it's supposed to be, and make sure it's within the range if there's such requirements based upon that. Okay? The next thing we're going to do is we're going to take all that data off of there if it's all valid and move it to my variables. Everybody good? Pretty easy, right? And as you can see, we're going to take the selected value. Remember that selected value piece? We're going to take that primary key, whatever they selected, and stick it into these variables here. We will go ahead and we'll go ahead and open up the server and connect to it. And then here's the first unique thing that you're going to come across. What we need to do is we need to, remember, we got to insert the primary key, right? If we go over here and look at our inserts, we got 1, 2, 3, 4. What we need to make sure of, though, any primary key we insert is unique. And so to do such a thing, what we're going to have to do is go to the database and find the last primary key, that's the max one, add 1 to it, and that will be the next primary key. So in my example here, you would go to Lance Kim, he'd be 4, he'd be my max one, I would add 1 to it, and that would be my next primary key. So whatever row I'm entering, he'd be number 5, or she'd be number 5. Does that make sense? It's not too hard, right? That's how we get the next primary key. I go ahead and in this, I got my select, I'm going to execute it, I'm going to read it, and as long as it's not null, meaning my source is not empty, if it is empty, my primary key will be 1 because I have nothing in there. If it's not empty, it's going to be whatever that next primary key is. See how that works there? Went ahead and made sure it was an integer and so on. And I moved that to that variable that I had up on top. What I'm going to do next is insert everything. I'm going to have another video that will go through this insert in a lot of details for you. And so I don't want to spend a lot of time here, but we're going to create that insert. We are going to then have an insert command for my OLD command piece. And we're going to do an execute non-query. Before we did an execute query, this is considered an execute non-query. That's what you run. If you recall that from the very first, some of the first videos we talked about, you're going to do an execute non-query. Okay? You do those for inserts, updates, and deletes. All queries, all selects, you do execute query. And then you show, you basically see if how many rows were affected. And if it's greater than 0, everything's been added good. If not, we probably have a problem. I'm not sure you really need this piece of code, but it's nice to see it. And we close our connection. And that's how we do an insert. Again, I'm going to have a video that will go through this piece right here in a little bit more detail and make sure you know how to build this string out. It's a little bit tricky, but not too bad. You'll understand it, but I want to spend some time on it. I don't think I'll have enough time in this video. All right? So that's how you do it. Execute non-query all the way through. And this is how it works. All right? Cool. I'll see you in the next video.